Hello, John Faithful Hamer here, on the top of Mount Royal, beautiful Montreal behind me. So in this video, I want to talk about the wisdom of the fall, and what I mean by that is what's thought of in the Judeo-Christian tradition as the fall of man or mankind, or which is the story told in the book of Genesis about how Adam and Eve get kicked out of paradise and cursed, right? Now, I'm gonna sort of unpack exactly what the story of the fall is and what it means as myth and what the curses refer to in a moment. But before I do that, I would just like to say it's interesting to note that declension narratives or fall narratives are found all over the place. It's not just in religious traditions, although you do find it, a lot of it in religious traditions. But you can also see environmentalist fall narratives, where you'll find a lot of environmentalists will say that there was this time in the past when we were at one with nature, and we lived kind of with balance and things like that. And then at some point we fell into modernity, or we fell into civilization, and that put us on a collision course against nature. And people will say that it happened at different points. Some people will say that it happened with the agricultural revolution, when we stopped being hunter-gatherers and roaming around, and we settled down in cities and we started planting fields and things like that. Some say it's more recent, but point being, it's this idea that at one point we lived in a kind of paradise and everything was amazing. A lot of anthropologists seem to have a really intense version of this, where they'll say that hunter-gatherers were just living this very utopian existence, and then we get into what we're living in now, which is just this horrible thing. I've encountered feminist fall narratives. There's a book that I used to assign to my classes years ago called The Creation of Patriarchy, which once again has this idea that in the past we lived in these totally kind of gender equal societies where men and women were totally equal and everything was amazing, and then we fell into patriarchy, and she explains why she believes this happened, right? So there's many different versions of the myth. It can be articulated it's very flexible. It can be articulated in religious language. It can be articulated in environmentalist language, in feminist language, all sorts of different things, right? And it's this basic idea that things were amazing at one point, and now they suck, and that's why we suffer so much, right? Okay, that being said, so the story that you find in the first book of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, is probably a familiar one to many of you. So Adam and Eve are created by God, and they are living in paradise. Everything's amazing, right? But God says, well, I've got, just a few restrictions on your freedom. You can't eat of the fruit of this tree in the middle of the garden, which is the tree of knowledge, right? The tree of knowledge of good and evil. And if you do eat from that tree, then you're gonna die. Your life is gonna, this whole paradise thing is done if you do that, right? So they live in paradise, they're chilling, they're hanging out, they're living life, everything's great. And then pretty soon the serpent, right, talking snake, goes and whispers to Eve and says, why don't you eat from that tree over there? It looks really tasty to me. And Eve is like, no, God said we can't touch that. We can't touch that. And he says, God is just being like, he knows that if you eat of that tree, you are going to become very powerful, and you're going to become like gods yourself. And God is a control freak, and he's power hungry, and he doesn't want you to have that power. That's the only reason he's telling you to like stay away from that one. You should try it. It'll be awesome. And the serpent almost sounds like the drug dealer in a 1980s after school special. Like, try it, you'll like it, everybody like it. So she gets convinced. She goes and says, she convinces Adam. She says, why don't we just try it? Like it's like she's proposing, like, that they have a threesome or swinging or something. Anyway, she proposes it to him, convinces him. He says yes, and so they eat of the fruit. Let's call it an apple. They eat of the apple, and right away, things go south and start to suck. They recognize that they're naked. I mean, I guess they were innocent before that. It never occurred to them that they were walking around like flying commando all the time. They recognize they're naked, and they feel shame. And pretty soon God comes, looking for them, and they're hiding from God, and God is totally pissed, and he says, all right, that's it. No more Mr. Nice Guy, no more paradise for you. Kicks them out of the Garden of Eden, kicks them out of paradise, and he curses them, right? And these curses are really, really fascinating. So his curse on Adam is, he says, you will have to earn your bread, right? Like earn your living, basically, like feed yourself by the sweat of your brow, right? So you're going to have to work really, really hard in order to keep body and soul together, in order to stay alive, right? And then he curses Eve and says, you're going to be subject to your husband. But the more interesting part is, it says, you are going to have great pains in childbirth. Now, thinking about these curses is really quite fascinating. Now, you have to put yourself in the mindset of a human being that was living, in the Near East a couple thousand years ago, and you're looking around at the world around you. You're looking at your life. You're looking at the life of people who are still sort of like living the hunter-gatherer life around you, looking at the life of other animals, right, in your environment. And some things would have just jumped out at that our hypothetical ancient ancestor right away if they were, even the least bit kind of aware and thoughtful. They would have noticed, first of all, that humans seem to work, like bust their ass, like way more than any other successful animals in the environment, right? Like if you look at most kind of apex predators, or that, like, I don't know, like a crocodile, a Nile crocodile, or a lion, or a bear, or something, something that has achieved success in an environment, most of the time they just chill out. Most of the time they don't. I mean, they expend energy if they are trying to get food, or maybe if they're trying to get away from something, or if they're, but for the most part they chill, right? They look, if you're at the bottom of the food chain, or if you're in the middle, then you have to be like a squirrel. You're like completely wired and like always looking, because so many things want to eat you, and you're just like very kind of, you gotta be going all the time, right? Or if you're low down on the food chain, you maybe have to spend a huge amount of time eating or looking for food, because, right, you're living a very precarious existence. But our ancient ancestor would have looked around and said, we seem to like work really, really, really hard, and a lot of the time, right? Now, the reason for this is essentially because of agriculture, right? Now, for most of our history as a species, and by that I mean, let's say we've been more or less in our present form for about let's say 300,000 years. I mean, they keep changing the date. It keeps getting like older and older all the time. But let's say, for argument's sake, about 300,000 years, right? Now, for about 200, roughly, depending upon the place, but for roughly 290,000 of those years, we were hunter-gatherers, right? And this is, we would roam around from place to place, and we would just eat whatever was available at the time. So if there were berries were available in August, which is what it is right now, let's say there were lots of berries in season. Well, we would go to the place where the berries were, and we would eat a lot of berries, right? If nuts were in season somewhere, we would go eat that, right? If there were salmon in the river because it was the salmon run, right, we would go and have salmon, right? If there were some kinds of birds that were nesting in the down by the St. Lawrence River, we would go and eat bird eggs and have like a lot of bird for a little while. We would sort of move around from place to place and get whatever was available. Now, the hunter-gatherer existence, generally speaking, it meant that a group of humans, and most hunter-gatherer groups were not very large. I mean, we're talking groups of maybe, it depends from place to place, but maybe like 150 individuals, right, would be like a big hunter-gatherer group. I mean, there might be some really big ones that would be sort of 200, but there'd be lots of smaller ones that would be more like 30 or 50 individuals, smaller groups. But let's say, for argument's sake, a hunter-gatherer group in the Montreal area behind me, like this Montreal Island, you might have a group of 150 humans, and they would roam around the area depending upon what was available to eat. And it would require like a big area, a big range to provide the caloric intake, the amount of food to feed, let's say, this group of 150 hunter-gatherers, right? And that was our existence for a really long time, right? But then along comes agriculture, right? And the agricultural revolution happened in different places in different parts of the world. In some places it might have meant having rice paddies. In other areas it might have been growing wheat to make bread. In other areas it could have been potatoes, corn, all sorts of different things. Once you have agriculture, that changes everything, right? Because now the quantity of food that you can produce is unbelievable. You can have a far more steady food supply, and you have way more of it. So now an area that normally, let's say like the island of Montreal, or the island of Manhattan, or an area that could support, let's say, at most a couple hundred humans tops, because they have to roam around, they have to find like different things to eat, and if there's too many of them, they will overfish, or they will eat too many of the berries, or they will eat too many, whatever, they'll overdo it. So an area that normally could support only a couple hundred humans, after the agricultural revolution, you can have a community of not 150, 200, you can support now a community of 10,000, right? A much, much bigger number of people now, right? Because the quantity of food has gone way, way up. Unfortunately, the quality of the food has gone way, way down, right? So hunter-gatherers ate a wide variety of things. So they had a very nutritious diet. They were omnivores, right? So which means we are, by nature, we're supposed to eat a lot of different stuff to make sure that we get all of the various vitamins and minerals that we need and the various things, right? Well, once you get down to settled agriculture, you have way more food, so you can support larger populations, but those populations are not going to be as healthy as the hunter-gatherers, because we don't realize this, but for most of settled human history in the last 10,000 years, whatever your staple crop was, most people living in that community ate almost nothing but that. So if you lived in China for the last couple thousand years, most people in China, I mean, not the super rich and the kind of the wealthy elite, but most people in China were eating rice, and they were getting the vast majority of their calories from rice. So they would have rice for breakfast, lunch, and dinner kind of thing, right? And likewise, if you were living in, let's say, ancient Egypt or places that had wheat, you would be having wheat, like you would be having bread or some kind of something made out of wheat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. If you had corn, you would be having corn. Pretty much all of your 90%, 95% of your calories would be coming from this one thing, right? I mean, this is another story, but that's what happened with the Irish potato famine in many ways, right? Because you get potatoes are brought over from the New World as part of the Columbian Exchange, and they go to places like Scandinavia and to Ireland, places that are pretty cold and rainy, and they can't grow that many crops, and so you never had very large populations in those areas. Well, suddenly with the potato, you have population explosion in places like this, and you can support places that had lived, pretty marginal existence based on like a little bit of subsistence agriculture and fishing and some hunting and things like that. Places that never could support a lot of humans suddenly could support huge populations because of the potato. But then when the potato, you get these kind of infections, fungal infections of potatoes, and insect pests that wipe out entire crops, then you get famines, right? So, but before the Irish potato famine hits, you have most people in Ireland were consuming, I've seen some amazing estimates, consuming as much as 95% of their calories were coming from potatoes, right? So eating so much of one thing, especially like a grain or a legume or something like that, means that in settled agriculture, when there was this transition from hunter-gatherers to people living in settled agricultural villages and towns and cities, the health of humans declined. And we can see this in actually the skeletons of hunter-gatherers vis-a-vis settled agriculturalists. They got shorter. They lost a couple inches in height. They show their skeletons show all sorts of signs of various kinds of nutritional deficiencies. So it's one of these things, right, where like settling down into cities with farming and agriculture, it was a good deal in the sense that you had like much more food and you could support more people, but it came at a cost, right? You're not as healthy, and you had to work way more than ever before. I mean, most anthropologists figure that the typical hunter-gatherer was probably working, somewhere between like 10 and 15 hours a week, right? They were not, it was, you spent like 10, 15 hours a week going hunting, fishing, trapping, maybe gathering things, making a fire, looking for wood, sharpening your spears, fixing your net, mending your nets, whatever. But the rest of the time, hunter-gatherers pretty much, they just like chilled out. Like they would just sit around the campfire, telling stories, gossiping, taking naps, hanging out with their family, playing with their kids. And it's good to remember, right? these hunter-gatherers, that's most of our evolutionary past. They were every bit as intelligent as we are. Yuval Noah Harari argues in *Sapiens* that they were probably, in many ways, actually smarter than us because they didn't have the benefit that we have. One of the benefits of civilization is that you can specialize, right? You can know a great deal about one thing and nothing about almost everything else, right? Well, hunter-gatherers didn't have that luxury. They were in smaller communities, and every member of the community had to know how to do a lot of things. So everybody had to know how to hunt. I mean, there might be some members of the community that were better at hunting than others, but everybody had to know how to hunt. Everybody had to know how to sort of have a sense of direction, right? Everybody had to know how to fight. Everybody had to know these things. They had to, how to, So it's probably the case that they were at least as smart as we are, and possibly more competent in many ways, right? But anyway, so they suddenly, right, we are in this new environment, right? And we have to work when they settle down with agriculture. So you have people who have been for 290,000 years, let's say, at least, working 10, 15 hours a week, chilling out most of the time, right? Suddenly, when you went into agriculture, you were working way, way more than that. Like, with agriculture, now it's more like 10 to 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year round, or almost all year round, right? Because agriculture is really, really hard work. It's once you have your plants in the ground, you need to make sure that they get enough water, right? That is not obvious at all. And that means you're going to maybe have to dig ditches that go on for miles and miles and miles to irrigate your fields, to bring water to where your fields are. If that's not possible, very often it means you're going to have to go to a water source, to a lake, to a stream, to a river, and actually take jugs of water and carry them to your fields to water your crops, to make sure that they get enough water. If that's not possible because things are too far, you may have to dig wells, right? And then bring up the water from the well and then go water your crops, right? That's an incredible amount of work, right? That's why, once again, Yuval Noah Harari in *Sapiens*, he suggests that maybe crops like wheat, it's not that we domesticated wheat, maybe wheat domesticated us, all right? But anyway, leaving that aside. Then also, once you have fields of wheat or rice paddies or things like that, you have a whole bunch of other jobs you have to do. You have to weed your fields or your gardens. You have to weed them constantly, right? You have to protect them from all sorts of pests. There's all sorts of insects that want to eat them. So you have to spend a great deal of time going over your plants, picking off all of the insects that are trying to eat them. Then you have birds, all sorts of birds that want to eat your crops. You have all sorts of rodents, rats, rabbits, mice. You have to defend your crops against all these animals and insects that want to eat your stuff, right? Then you also have to worry about various kinds of fungal infections and plant diseases and things. It's so relentless, right? And so to do that, it meant that aside for a tiny elite, the kind of the kings, the 1% of the ancient world, if you will, the priestly caste, except for a very small sliver of the population that could sit around and basically do nothing and live a life of leisure, most people in the transition from being hunter-gatherers to being settled agriculturalists, that was, for most people, meant a very, very difficult new thing where you had to work like crazy. So it makes perfect sense when you hear the story of the fall, that the curse on Adam is that he would have to work, right, and earn his bread, right? They say bread, not meat. Earn your bread by the sweat of your brow, right? This is kind of a mythological attempt to explain why it seems to suck to be a human so much that you have to work all the time, right? Now, the curse on Eve is equally fascinating, right? Saying that you will have great pain in childbirth, right? Now, one of the things our hypothetical ancient ancestor would have noticed, because they lived around, they kept animals, they had horses, they had cows, they had goats, they had sheep, they had animals around, they had dogs, cats, things like that. And one thing you notice if you have kept animals is that most animals don't have a hard time. Nothing like us. Most animals don't have a hard time giving birth. It's not this like horrible, painful ordeal that it can go on for a really long time and is often life-threatening. Right? If you've ever watched like your cat have kittens or your dog have puppies, it's not you don't hear about cats dying in childbirth very often. You don't hear about dogs dying in childbirth, right? But up until the advent of modern medicine, I mean, we're talking like basically a century, right? In many places, half century. Up until the advent of modern medicine, a lot of women died in childbirth. You go to any old cemetery, right? If you go to the cemetery here on Mount Royal, any cemetery that has like a lot of graves of people who died, let's say before 1900, what you will notice is again and again and again, you'll see these young women who died sometime either kind of their late teens, 20s, early 30s. And you'll see like when they were born and when they died, and say died in childbirth, died in childbirth, died in childbirth. You see this again and again and again. It's really, really sad. Right? So many women died in childbirth that it actually skewed the life expectancy of women. So men had a higher life expectancy, often by as much as a decade or a decade and a half than women. And this is, you have to think how amazing that is, because there's all sorts of dangerous things that men did in the past that women didn't do, like for instance going to war and doing like really, really dangerous jobs, right? So even though women were not doing those things, they still had a lower life expectancy, and that's because of all the women who died in childbirth, right? If you look on, this happens so many times, if you look on Wikipedia at the life of some famous guy, from like the 17th century or the 18th century, the 19th century, one thing you notice with alarming regularity is they'll say, married to this woman from this year to this year, and to this woman from this year to this year. And, it was not uncommon for guys to have 3 wives over the course of their lifetime. Now today, when we see that on Wikipedia for some celebrity, it's because, he's getting divorced and he's like kind of marrying a different person every 5, like Tom Cruise or something, right? He's marrying a different person every 5 or 10 years. But back then, that's not what it was. It was that they would marry one woman, she would maybe like have one kid, and then the second kid, she would die in childbirth. And then he would be widowed, and then he would marry somebody else, have like 2 kids with her, and then she would die in childbirth during the 3rd kid, and then he would marry somebody else and have like another 2 kids like with her. This was just like completely part of the norm, right? Now that is very it's terrible, and it's shocking, and it's strange, right? We forget how completely strange it is, right? Now the reason for this, just to give you the short version of it, you can go online and find a longer version of it, but just the short version of it is that at some point in our evolutionary past, two things happened at the same time. We were getting much smarter. Our brains were getting much bigger, which means bigger heads, right? Bigger skull to contain a bigger brain. And we also started walking upright. We became bipedal, right? Now, those two things do not go very well together, right? Because to be bipedal, you need to have slimmer hips. If you look at the hips of many of our closest primate relatives, they have incredibly wide hips. Like, if you were to put it in, it would make the Kardashians look like they have incredibly small hips. If we had hips like a chimpanzee that was proportional to a chimpanzee or an orangutan or a gorilla, our hips would be, it would look cartoonish. Like, you've never seen somebody with hips like as wide, even though the person you've seen with the widest hips, nothing like what they would be, right? So for those kinds of, for our primate relatives, having a big head, they could easily pass that through the birth canal. But because we became bipedal, our hips started getting smaller, heads are getting bigger. So at some point in our evolutionary past, there must have been this bottleneck must have caused a lot of human females to die. They would just not be able to give birth to the baby at all, right? Probably the gestation period for a human being should probably be somewhere between 1.5 years and 2 years, right? That would be kind of make much more sense, right? But obviously, if you think how hard it is for human females to give birth to a 9-month-old, imagine having to give birth to a 2-year-old. That would be just like, imagine how pregnant you would be if you were giving birth to a 2-year-old. That's completely insane, right? But right, that would actually make more sense. That's probably what our gestation period should be, right? More like elephants or many other very intelligent mammals that have these long gestation periods, right? But that would not work because that kid would be way too big. So most people who study this theorize that at some point there was a mutation where there were some women who just had a tendency to give birth prematurely. So they would just go into labor at 9 months rather than much longer gestation period. And because they would go into labor at 9 months, it meant that the baby was much smaller, which of course it still meant that was going to be really difficult, right? That was going to be a lot of human females were not going to be able to live through that experience anyway. But the chances were way better at 9 months than it would be at 1.5 years or 2 years, right? But this has all sorts of long-term consequences, which I'll deal with in some other videos. But this means that human babies are very exceptionally helpless for a long time. I mean, you look at like giraffes and horses and various animals. I mean, they're born, and within like a few minutes of being born, they're up on their legs and walking and doing their thing, right? That's not the case with human babies. Human babies are really helpless for quite a while, right? Now, if we had a longer gestation period and we could they were born at like 2, well then maybe it might be possible for a human baby to be walking around not long after birth. Who knows? But that's not the case, and that has a lot of interesting downstream effects. But so all human babies are born premature. what we think of as the normal gestation period, 9 months, is actually probably quite premature, right? But even then, it is still, up until modern medicine, it's been something that has been very, very difficult, right? Now, you can understand how this ancient ancestor of ours, looking around and saying, we have to work so hard just to kind of get by and just to like eat and stuff like that. And our women, like so many women die in childbirth, and childbirth is so painful. Like, God, it kind of sucks to be a human. Like, it kind of sucks to be us. Like, it's as if we're living under a bunch of curses, right? So I think it's interesting to look at the, I would say what I call the wisdom of the fall, the wisdom of the story of the fall as presented in the book of Genesis, is that I don't think it's factually true that there were Adam and Eve and they were kicked out of the Garden of Eden and cursed in that. I don't think it's historically true in the sense that it happened, like the American Revolution happened, right? But I think it does point to something very true, right? Which is that we all sense that something is wrong, right? And I think the wisdom of the fall is that it points to the fact that there is some sort of a conflict or a disconnect between human nature or human biology, our physiology, and our environment, right? That it's as if we have, Claude Lévi-Strauss, the famous anthropologist, he said that it's a kind of homelessness, that we live in the world and we're a part of the world, but we constantly sense that somehow we don't fit, right? That we are the sick animal, as Nietzsche put it, right? And I think the reason for this is that partially it has to do with technology, right? Technology is kind of one of our superpowers as a species. It's amazing, right? And technology allows us to go places that we really have no business being. It allows us to survive in places that we have no business being. It allows us to eat things, with cooking. Cooking is a technology. Clothing is a technology, right? I mean, we are basically a naked ape, right? We have no business being in a climate like this. Montreal, I mean, it's warm now, but it gets crazy cold here. For about half the year, like, it's freezing cold, and a human being, we don't have fur, like the animals that are from here. We don't have fur. We can't survive in the winter. If you put a human being without clothing outside in January here, they'll be dead in not long, a few hours tops, right? We can survive in this place because of technology. So we went to places, more northern places, like after the last ice age, for instance, and it was very cold. And what did we do? We just went and killed an animal that does belong there, and made a fur coat out of that animal, and made a hat and some gloves and some shoes or something like that, or some boots, and we wear that stuff, and that warm coat, those furs, become a technology that allows us to live in that cold environment that we actually really are not evolved to live there, right? And building a house, that's another kind of technology, right? Learning how to make fire, right, as a way to, and burning wood inside our house and making heat with that, or later on burning peat or coal or fossil fuels, or now basically harnessing hydroelectric power from rushing rivers in northern Quebec and bringing it down to Montreal to light it up with electricity, and so that I can put on the thermostat and keep my place warm in the middle of the winter, right? That's all technology, right? And in all those instances, or going down to a place that, like Arizona, that is really, really hot and dry, and I can build a house and have air conditioning, which allows you to live once again in an environment that is not very hospitable to a human being, but through technology we can do that, right? And I mentioned cooking. That's another technology. Cooking allows us to eat lots of things that we normally could not eat because they are either poisonous to us, or it basically pre-digests our food. I know that sounds really gross, but that's essentially what a lot of cooking is. It's pre-digesting food. And cooking is a technology that allows us to eat all sorts of things that we couldn't otherwise eat, right? Now, this is great. I mean, I'm not down on technology at all. I think technology is fantastic. It's one of our superpowers as a species. But one of the downsides of that is that we increasingly create environments that are alienating to us, right? We can survive in them. It's like moving to an agricultural town 10,000 years ago. You can have a lot more food, but it might not be very healthy, and you might not be comfortable. You might constantly feel that your fortress of technology has become a prison to some extent, right? There's always that, it can go both ways. So on the one hand, it's really nice that you have a warm kind of house that you can be in January in a cold climate, and that's wonderful. But at the same time, you might, by the end of the winter, start feeling really cooped up and feeling like, I really want to go outside and this sucks and I'm sick of being inside all the time, right? And likewise, I know people who've lived in incredibly hot places, and yeah, it's really nice that you can hang out in an air-conditioned shopping mall or house and be able to get away from the heat. But once again, after a while, people say, like, I'm sick of being inside all the time, and I wish, I'm sick of this summer, I'm sick of this heat, right? So we are the whiny animal, right? We are whiny animals, and that are always complaining about this and that, right? And that's because there's basically a disconnect, an opposition between our bodies, our psychology, our basic kind of our nature, our psychology, our physiology. There is that psychology and that physiology, that body, right, evolved for most of our evolutionary past to a particular kind of world. It was a hunter-gatherer world. It was a world with a certain kind of environment, right? A certain kind of community, right? And that's what we evolved to fit into, right? Now we live in mass societies in this incredible built environment. Well, you can see this big city behind me, right? And that's amazing, right? But it means that in many ways we just don't fit in. And I think the wisdom of these fall narratives, all of them, is that they sort of point to that cleavage. I'll just sort of finish with one final example of that. A lot of the things that we desire and fear made sense for most of our evolutionary past. So for instance, it makes sense. Most humans are, I am right now on a cliff, which is like very, very steep. If I fell off this, well, this video would be, that was the last thing John did before he died. So I'm on a very steep cliff right now. Most humans are afraid of heights. Just from day one, right? There's one of the things that's amazing about our species is there's a high degree of variance in us. We are, that's also one of our superpowers to some extent. So yeah, there's a small minority of people who are born without a fear of heights, and we're quite malleable, so you can sort of train yourself to not be afraid of heights. But most people, their default position is they are born with a fear of heights. Now, it makes perfect sense why that would be the case, right? Because for most of our history, we lived in caves. We lived in kind of on mountaintops. That was a good place to kind of hide from predators, and it gave us a good secure place. So the people who weren't afraid of heights probably would engage in reckless, careless behaviors, and they would be more likely to die and less likely to pass on their genetic material to next generations. And so, surprise, surprise, over time, you end up with a species that most people, if they are close to an edge, they pay attention, right? They really focus. Now, most of us are not afraid of speed, right? This is why people will, like, the most dangerous activity you engage in if you live in Canada, the United States, is driving, right? Driving is like a very dangerous activity, but as a species, we've only had the ability to travel at 100 miles an hour, or 120 kilometers an hour. We've only had the ability to go that fast. It's in evolutionary terms, it's a blink of an eye. It's like half century, right? It's not long, a little more than that maybe in some places. So we have these technologies, cars, which allow us to move very, very quickly, but it's very new, right? So most people are not afraid of it. And this is why you can have people kind of talking on the phone while they're driving on the highway really fast, or you're even texting while they're driving, or listening to music and singing along. And if you measure their heart rate and their breathing and their blood pressure, they're totally chill. They're totally relaxed, right? Now, if somehow we could live in our present state, and that's not going to happen, but let's say for argument's sake, if we could live in our present state with civilization as it is right now in, let's say, North America for the next 10,000 years, I think it's pretty good guess is that we would evolve the same kind of basic fear of speed that we now have of heights. I think people who are not afraid of speed would gradually get weeded out. They would be more likely to die in accidents. They would be more likely to, and the people who take speed very, very seriously, who, when they are driving in a car, if they get a phone call or they text, they don't answer it because they're more kind of like wired, and they get like a little bit of an adrenaline thing, and when they are driving, they really take it seriously. Like that task has their full attention completely. Those people would be more likely, on average, to survive. And then gradually, through selection pressures, I think you would end up with a human species where most people had a natural fear of speed. I don't mean a debilitating fear, like a crippling anxiety. I mean, put it this way, as I've said to students many times, like, imagine if you were walking along a ledge of one of those really, really tall buildings behind me. Like, you're walking right on the edge of a 20-story building, let's say, right? And your phone rings in your pocket, right? Would you reach in and answer your phone? Like, no. Like, you would not. You would let that go to message. Like, you would call that person later on, right? Because the task of walking on that ledge and not falling off, that task would have your full attention. Your mind would not be wandering. You would be really focusing on walking on that ledge, right? That is a product of our evolutionary past. And if we actually calculated risks intelligently, we would have exactly the same attitude when we were driving, right? We would not answer that call. We would not let our mind wander, because the task at hand would have our full attention, right? But it doesn't, right? And this is just one example among many, right? That our nature and our physiology does not properly fit our environment. And I think the great, and that is, a lot of human suffering comes from that, and a lot of our sense of alienation and a lot of our unhappiness comes from that place, right? So I'll talk about this more in future videos, but I think that is the deep wisdom of the fall. We'll also probably I'll have a video on Freud, civilization and its discontents, because he provides a kind of the founder of modern psychology, and he provides a very interesting secular explanation for why individuals are need civilization. Like, civilization is a good deal on balance, but that civilization means that individuals are going to have more or less kind of discontent and unhappiness, right? Because you have to make all of these sacrifices in order to be a part of civilization. All right, well, thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you later.